Becoming the strongest character in Diablo 4 and conquering the toughest content in the game. That is undoubtedly the ultimate goal in Diablo 4, and it's what everyone strives for in the end. However, becoming powerful and boosting your damage is not as easy as it sounds. It requires understanding the somewhat complex gear system and, most importantly, how damage is built and therefore calculated in the game. Explaining this concept is not a simple task. It involves a bit of mathematics, and I've spent a long time contemplating how to simplify it to make it clear and understandable for everyone. I want to ensure that everyone grasps how to maximize their own damage output and which stats on items truly matter. So today let's dive into how you can get the most out of your character. Stick around until the end for some information on how to win the Ultimate Edition of Diablo 4 in a recent giveaway. To be able to calculate damage, you first need to understand that it is categorized into what we call damage buckets. These are groups that hold specific damage values which are simply added together. It's just basic addition, which makes the value of the individual bucket higher. However, all of the damage buckets are then multiplied with each other afterwards, meaning you don't simply add them up, but rather multiply them. When done correctly, this results in an extremely high damage output. But first, let's understand the various damage buckets. They consist of the following values: your base damage, which I'll explain in detail shortly, your additive damage bucket, your multiplicative damage bucket, the damage bucket against vulnerable enemies, critical hit chance and critical hit damage bucket, overpower damage bucket, and the damage bucket of your attribute bonuses. To explain all these values using my barbarian as an example, let's briefly explore the materials and stats section. We'll focus on the damage of my bludgeoning weapon, as it is the weapon I use to unleash my primary skill, Hammer of the Ancients, which generates my main damage. Of course, you'll need to adjust all of this based on your class and the weapons you use with your skills. For instance, a rogue using a crossbow would focus on precision weapon damage. Weapon damage multiplied by skill damage gives us our base damage, which is our first damage bucket. The second damage bucket consists of all additive damage forms, such as damage versus close enemies, damage versus healthy enemies, damage versus injured enemies, damage versus bleeding enemies, damage with physical attacks, and so on. You'll find several affixes related to these on your weapons and jewelry. However, they're added together and grouped into a single damage bucket, so you shouldn't just focus on them. Next, let's look at the damage bucket for multiplicative damage sources. These are usually identified by an X and closed in square brackets, and are found on passive nodes in your skill tree or as legendary affixes on gear. The next damage bucket consists of a single value, damage against vulnerable enemies. By default, this provides a 20% increase in damage, but you can further boost it with various affixes on your weapons and jewelry. Since this damage bucket has only one value, it becomes an extremely powerful multiplier that you should prioritize if you're able to make enemies vulnerable with your attacks. The next damage bucket comprises critical hits. Critical hits provide a base damage increase of 50%, which can be further enhanced by attributes. This bucket is composed of your critical hit chance multiplied by your critical hit damage, so increasing both significantly influences your damage. Another damage bucket is dedicated to overpower damage, which has a base value of 50% additional damage. You can again raise this value through affixes on gear. Additionally, overpower damage is also dependent on your current life and fortify. This means that the higher these two values, the greater the damage of your overpower. However, overpower damage has only a 3% chance to trigger, which is quite low. Therefore, you can only utilize overpower damage effectively if, for example, you play as a druid with certain skills that guarantee overpower. It's also very important to note that overpower damage is not multiplied, but rather added at the very end of your damage calculation. In general, when it comes to damage against vulnerable enemies, critical hit damage and overpower damage, you need to consider your class. Some classes may excel in one aspect while struggling with another. Therefore, it makes sense to build your character around your class's strength. For example, rogues work exceptionally well with critical hit damage or critical hit chance, hence it would be wise to focus more on those values. On the other hand, barbarians can benefit greatly from damage against vulnerable enemies. And lastly, we have the damage bucket related to your attribute values. Here you must also pay attention to the class you're playing. Different attributes are important for maximizing your damage output. For barbarians, strength increases damage. For rogues, it's dexterity. Druids rely on willpower, while necromancers and sorcerers benefit from intelligence. Therefore, it makes sense to prioritize increasing the attribute value relevant to your class in order to generate more damage. Okay, I know that was a lot of information at once. Unfortunately, it's a highly complex topic. So if there's anything you didn't fully grasp, I recommend watching the video again until you reach this point. But now let's take a look at an example calculation to further illustrate everything and put the theory into practice. We'll focus on 6 different damage buckets: base damage, additive damage, multiplicative damage, damage against vulnerable enemies, critical hit chance, and finally, overpower damage. For simplicity's sake, let's assume a base weapon damage of 100. In reality, this value would be much higher, however using 100 makes the calculation easier to understand. In our additive damage bucket, let's say we have 3 affixes, each providing a plus 50% damage boost. For instance, as a barbarian, we could have plus 50% damage versus close enemies, plus 50% damage versus bleeding enemies, and plus 50% damage with bludgeoning weapons. And for our multiplicative damage bucket, we'll consider the key passive Unbridled Rage, which increases the damage of core skills by a whopping 135%. By default, we already have plus 20% damage against vulnerable enemies. And for this calculation, let's assume an additional 30% damage against vulnerable enemies. In our critical hit bucket, we'll assume we have a 100% critical hit chance and 100% critical hit damage. Regarding overpower damage, let's assume we have a 100% damage bonus and overpower triggers at 500 life and 500 fortify. In this scenario, our 100 base damage would be multiplied by 250% from the additive damage bucket, then by 235% from the multiplicative damage bucket, further multiplied by 150% from the damage against vulnerable enemies bucket, and finally by 200% for the critical hit bucket. This results in 1762.5 damage. And that is over 17 times the base damage of 100. So this is already a huge increase of damage, but keep in mind that this example is highly simplified, as you would typically have higher additive bonuses in each bucket, leading to significantly higher values and greater potential for improving your base damage through these bonuses. If we now add the overpower damage of 1200 additional damage to this calculation, we reach a total of 2962.5 damage for this single attack. That's nearly 30 times the base damage, so it's quite impressive when you manage to combine all these sources of damage and drastically increase your overall damage output. But as I mentioned before, this topic is extremely complex and I understand that it may not be easy to grasp right away. Therefore, I recommend watching the video a second or even a third time, because understanding this concept is crucial in Diablo 4 for maximizing your damage. It's essential for choosing the right skills, passive bonuses, and affixes on your gear, ultimately leading to success in the late and endgame stages. By the way, in one of my recent videos, there's a giveaway happening for the Ultimate Edition of Diablo 4. Feel free to check it out for a chance to win. And now I have a small request. Producing videos like this one is always time consuming and often not really worth it from a content creator point of view. However, I believe this is an extremely important topic. That's why I wanted to create this video, and I would be delighted if you could show a little love by sharing it with your communities and friends. Leave a thumbs up on the video and write a comment about whether it was helpful to you. If you enjoy this kind of content and want to stay updated on everything related to Diablo 4, consider subscribing to the channel and activating the notification bell so you don't miss any future videos. Additionally, if you like to support the channel further, check out the links to my partner Instant Gaming in the video description. They offer gift cards for your console store or Blizzard, allowing you to save some money on your next purchase while simultaneously supporting the channel. Thank you very much. But that's it for the video. I wish you all an awesome day and I'll catch you in the next one.